Okay, so in section 1.4, we're going to talk about complex numbers. And a lot of textbooks do this. They just kind of put all the information you need to know about complex numbers in one section. Remember when we had something like the square root of -5? And we said, oh, that's not real. And that's true. It's not real. Okay, but we do have ways that we can work with it. And it's based on what's called the imaginary unit. So we have the imaginary unit is I, and I is equal to the square root of -1. Okay, so this is by definition. We have a new letter I that we're using to represent the square root of -1. Okay, so remember that piece. That's important. The other piece that we remember, or try to remember, is that I squared equals -1. Now, if you think about those two things together, hopefully it'll make sense. And this is by definition. We're going to say we want to deal with square roots of negative numbers, and this is how we're going to deal with them. So now, instead of writing the square root of -5, we can write, oh, that's the square root of 5 times the square root of -1. Or we can write it as the square root of 5. Now this is going to be I. Now you can write it this way, and when I was a kid, we wrote it with the I in the back. A lot of times now they'll put the I in front of the radical. Okay, so like this. So I think we're going to see it more like this. Okay? All right, that is the imaginary unit is I. This is called an imaginary number, okay, because it has the imaginary unit in it. All right. Anything that has I in it is part of the complex numbers, okay? I don't like the way I said that, but it's true. All complex numbers can be written in the form a plus bi. Now, that form, we are pretty faithful with using that form. So all complex numbers can be written this way, and a and b are real numbers, which that's important. We're used to the real numbers. That's the set we've been working with. But now we have this imaginary unit in there. Okay, so that's how we write our imaginary numbers. We put it in a plus bi form. Okay. So now we have a new set of numbers, the complex numbers. The complex numbers, that includes all real numbers. So every real number that you already know is a complex number. We prefer to talk about them as a real number because it defines it a little bit better. And now we can include anything that has the imaginary unit, or all imaginary numbers. That doesn't say imaginary. Oh, imaginary. Okay, there we go. So what's an imaginary number? Well, it's anything you can put in a plus bi form where b is not 0. Okay? So now let's talk about that a minute. If you just had a, that's a real number. Okay, so that falls in that category if you just have a. That means that b is equaling 0. Okay? You can have a real number like 7 or the square root of 17 or 2/3. All of those are real numbers. These are all real numbers. Well, it's not all the real numbers, but those are all examples of real numbers, and they're all complex numbers. And you might say, well, what about that a plus bi form? You said we had to put it in a plus bi form. Okay, so if you want to write 7 in a plus bi form, it's 7 plus 0i. And the square root of 17 plus 0i. You could do that for all of these. And there it is. B is 0, which is a real number, and a is a real number as well. Okay, they're not imaginary numbers, but they are all complex numbers. So imaginary numbers, back over here, that's when b is not 0. So you could have something like 5 plus 3i. Or you could have 2/3 plus 5/3i. Those are examples of imaginary numbers, okay? All right, and those are both in a plus bi form. A pure imaginary number, that's when a equals 0. So that's when you just have something like 7i, or the square root of 5i, and we're going to put the I in front of the radical. Okay, those are pure imaginary numbers because there's no, plus a. Now, if you wanted to write it in a plus bi form, you'd write 0 plus 7i. 0 plus, I'm going to write I square root 5. Okay, but these are pure imaginary numbers where a equals 0. Okay, so that's a little bit of some of the terminology we're going to use. We have a new set of numbers. They're called the complex numbers. It includes all real numbers, and it includes any imaginary number, any number that has an I in it. Okay? And all complex numbers can be written in a plus bi form. Okay? So a lot of times they're going to say, leave your answer in a plus bi form.